Hello, this is RipRapYap. This is our second episode. My name is Peter Smith.
And I'm Alexis Reagan.
And we are joined by our guest here today. How would you like to introduce yourself?
Hi, I am Chelsea Allen.
And tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I am a recent MFA graduate from Cal State Long Beach, and I'm currently teaching on campus. Hello, composition students.
That's great. So I understand we have some questions here today.
Yeah, so I can definitely jump in.
Yeah.
So, Chelsea, first of all, thank you for being here on the podcast. I know I had the pleasure of meeting you over summer, and you took me under your wing like when I was going into the program myself. So my first icebreaker question is just, what is the best writing advice you've ever personally received, and why?
Great question. The best piece of writing advice actually came from my sister. So speaking of taking you under my wing, my sister has done the same thing for me. She was told by a professor here at Cal State Long Beach to never use the word being in an essay. There is always a better way to say it. And after I started practicing this, I found my writing was more direct. And as someone who loves writing, it's been a fun challenge to implement that. Now, when it comes to poetry, we are more likely to receive good criticism than good advice. It only becomes good advice when the critic truly understands what your poetry aesthetic is. During my first semester of grad school, Patty Seaburn said we should try to always end on an image. And this altered my brain chemistry.
Love that.
So now when I'm in a poem, I always have an exit point for that poem. And sometimes if I think of a cool image, it becomes the catalyst for the beginning of the piece as well.
I love that. And I, just to emphasize like the importance of imagery in poetry, like love Patty Seaburn's advice because it's so important. Even our MFA advisor, David Hernandez, he has echoed this. Imagery and sound in poetry is so important. Yes. And so that's awesome. I'm curious with the being, with your sister's advice, like, can you give like a little example? What would that be like in a sentence? If like you said being, and how do you shift it to make it more constructive?
Yeah. So if I were to say, I can give an example, but it might not be grammatically correct.
That's okay.
Being a poet allows me to be more empathetic.
Oh, okay, I get you.
So if I were to shift that, I could say, as a poet who pays close attention to detail, I have become more empathetic.
That there's a total shift there. That sounds more professional.
Yeah. Well, I think with the word being or words like that in general, I think what they are is a bit boring. Because things like being or I feel or I don't know. Things,
elementary a little bit.
Well, it's a missed opportunity, really. And with poems or poetry or just writing in general, but especially poetry, it's usually so condensed. Unless you're talking about like epic poems like the Iliad, but I don't count that. It's so condensed where every single word has to be intentional and have meaning, right? And you're trying to build this imagery. So when you're using things like, I was like at the beach and it made me feel good to be there and I was being relaxed, I was like, what?
Being feels elementary.
Yeah.
But
Better way to say that.
Yeah. And I know your background is poetry, so thank you for mentioning that imagery example.
Yeah.
So I can't wait to dive in today with what you brought as a collection of poetry too. So just to dive in, let's talk about the intersection between poetry and essay writing. I know when I had approached you and invited you on the podcast, you had sort of pitched this, maybe we can talk about how certain practices in poetry can cross over in essay writing. How do you see that unfold?
Sure. In my experience, when you write poetry and when you read poetry, you aren't focusing on the piece, the poem as a whole, at least not at first. I write line by line, sentence by sentence, and if we break that down even more, I am writing word by word because I pay attention to how each letter sounds and how each letter feels as it rolls off the tongue. Ezra Pound wrote about choosing the right word for your intended meanings. And we know words have definitions, but they also have associations. In poetry, you have to make every word count, kind of like with the word being. We're not going to choose the word being because there's something more interesting to say. I use language that is both intentional and pleasing. This crosses over into rhetorical strategies and argumentative essay writing because when you're making an argument, you want to use persuasive language. So understanding word associations will strengthen your rhetoric. But writing poetry improves your writing skills for any essay genre, not just argumentative, because you'll expand your vocabulary. You'll begin to use more direct and concise language, and in my opinion, your sentences as a whole will be more interesting. I've read essays that sound repetitive because the author will use the same words back to back, and it can make an essay really tedious to read. So when you practice poetry, you are more likely to catch repetition because you pay closer attention to how words flow together, not just for meaning, but for the auditory pleasure.
I think, I think it works the other way too, with argumentative writing helping with poetry. I don't know, at least in my experience. I think for the longest time, I didn't really do creative writing. I really liked argumentative essays. And that's what I started doing. I was on speech and debate in high school and whatever. And when I started writing, the creative writing, I don't know, it felt a bit disorganized. And I started, I guess, trying to be more surgical and precise with it. And the more I did that, the more I realized it was feeling like how it felt to write an essay, where each part has a function and those functions have to be specific to an overall point. And so in a way, narrative or poetry or whatever is all kind of structured in a similar way to how an argument is structured, where instead of trying to get across a certain logical point to prove something, you're trying to get across a specific image or a specific emotion or feeling. But the way to do that is similar.
That's so interesting. And I've never really thought about it that way. But then what you said struck me about this notion of you said pleasing and also, what was the other word? It was you give words that are pleasing.
Oh, and intentional.
And intentional, yes. And that's so powerful because I think about poetry as something not bottled up in a institutionalized paper. It's something that's organic and flowing and mysterious, like Patty Sebring also says, with mystery. But what you guys are saying about this argumentative approach of persuasively pulling the reader into this poem, dragging them in from the first line. That's so true. I think you sort of have that as the author and the writer to how am I going to attract the reader to dive into this poem, this essay? So that's amazing.
Yeah, Patty also says, and I'm sure lots of poets say this, but the first line of your poem and the last line of your poem should be the most interesting because you want to draw your reader in, but then you want to leave them with that final thought, that image, that sentiment. That's the last thing they see or feel when they turn the page. And I've never had trouble entering my poems, but that
exiting?
Yeah, the exiting. So that final line, I think something about an image is really powerful. And even if you choose not to end on an image, that's not going to work for every poetic style or for every poem in general, depending on your content. But even if it's not an image, thinking what that last line is going to be, make it a strong one.
Yeah, what's gonna be the mic dropper? And
yeah, that's the term I use to teach for when I teach my composition students conclusions. I say, hey, what's your mic drop sentence?
I love that.
Yeah.
And this isn't on the question sheet, but now that we're talking about, maybe I can bring up titles for a second.
Sure.
In current workshop right now with David Hernandez, I love it because he's I wish there was a hotline where we could call and say, what's the perfect title for this poem? Because sometimes titles can be hard. How for you, actually with essays and poems, because that a title is very something that's compelling that you're reading. And as you start, how do you approach titles? Are they mysterious or are they premeditative or both?
It's different every single time. So essay titles are very easy for me. I've never had issues with essay titles. It's, what's the essay about? There it is. Now for poetry, it's different. It's different every time. So depending on the poem, I might have a witty title. I have a poem named Verna. That's my grandmother's name, and the poem's about my grandmother, so I simply named it Verna. But then I have other poems that I've changed the title several times, and what is it? I can't even remember. Oh, so I have a poem titled Pink Silk, and that, I actually say this, I think I open up my thesis by saying this, but that poem underwent more title revisions than any other poem, and I don't even call it Pink Silk, I call it my croissant poem.
Wow.
And my cohort would understand that. It's, so titles, it's a different experience every single time, but the thing I can say, every time I title a poem, it is fun.
Yeah.
It is.
Well, I think titles, especially for poems, are important because they inform the work. They're as much a part of it as any individual line, in my opinion. It's like visual art, right? If you see like a big white canvas, right, covered in white paint, and it's called Rabbit in a Snowstorm or something, that's going to inform how you perceive it versus if it's just called white painting, right? And it's like, I don't know, it informs how you perceive it.
Helps to like evoke the story.
So,
Yeah,
so like oftentimes for my poems, it might just be what I think is the most important line or part of a line for the poem ends up being the title, but sometimes it's something not even contained within the poem. I don't know. And I just think titles, they don't get enough credit for how important they are, because what they do is kind of invisible, but it puts you into a frame of mind when you begin reading it, and that informs your perception of the entire poem.
Yeah, and I think the right one comes to us naturally, and it just feels right. But yeah, that's so cool. The next question, like, I know I had mentioned Marianne Baruch. She's a poet. We recently discussed in our workshop her book, Cadavers Speak. And in a video called In the Poetry Library with Marianne Baruch, she has thoughts on the parallels between poetic and essay form. And I know you watched that video too. I'd love to hear your thoughts on her perspective a little bit. And she talks about Wallace Stevens' idea of thought collecting in stanza or paragraph pools, which I thought was really cool.
Yeah. I'll start with her, the parallels between essay writing and poetry. She believes essay writing is closer to poetry than fiction, but I don't know that I necessarily agree. There is fluidity to essay writing and poetry that isn't always present in fiction, but this is dependent on essay genre and author. So an essay genre, if you are writing a medical research essay, that's not going to have the same fluidity as a personal narrative essay.
Right.
And with fiction, I've read plenty of fiction that has beautiful prose, but then I've read fiction that also it's built on dialogue, and that necessarily doesn't...
More sterile a little bit.
Yeah, that's a great way to describe it. For thought collecting, a paragraph can be a pool. Essays are more contained, more structured, again, depending on genre. Essays like organization.
True.
Stanzas, however, they can also be pools, but these boundaries in poetry aren't always effective. For example, in poetry, we use line breaks to carry our reader through the poem, but also to emphasize music, the sounds between vowels and consonants, and where you break your line builds that music. So thought collecting within a stanza is dependent on the poet and the poetic form as well. Take the stanza, or not the stanza, the sonnet, for example. You don't always break those into stanzas. You could break them into couplets if you wanted to. It's just different.
That's true. And like rhyme scheme and all of that. Yeah.
I think structural form, especially for poetry or for anything, is incredibly important. Like you're saying, like sonnets or whatever, it's a very specific kind of structure. But if you want to, you can break that structure at a specific point to bring attention to something. And I think similar things apply in essay writing or prose fiction. or what have you.
Yeah.
Where, I mean, I'm not familiar with the idea of thought collecting in paragraphs, but I can kind of get the gist where it's, you have paragraphs that are
It's pretty cool, huh? It's like
collection
sort of
thoughts.
like abstract
But-
to say that.
Yeah. But where you have like paragraphs dedicated to specific ideas.
Yeah.
And just by the proximity of those things together, you can connect two ideas that wouldn't be otherwise connected and imply some kind of a connection.
Yeah.
Like, I don't know if this is really relevant, but there's a very famous poem. I'm sure you guys are English people. You've read it, Girl by Jamaica Kincaid.
Yeah.
Where it's not, it toes the line between a poem and a short story because it's all kind of one big paragraph stream of thought. But it's a collection of ideas and, I don't know,
It's very
just the
declarative,
placement
yeah.
of two things together. In any other work where, you know, these are different ideas, they'd be near each other but not necessarily in the same paragraph or whatever, or in the same sentence even, and you kind of would dismiss it and be, oh, those are two things. But by having them be together, right, like in the poem it talks about, like, I think, like, how to wear a dress and how to be a girl, and then like how to wash, you know.
It's like a mother speaking to a daughter.
Right,
Yeah.
and then but it imparts meaning onto things simply by having them be in proximity to each other without doing anything else, just proximity.
That's wow. I like that thought, Peter.
Yeah.
Like this closeness, and like, you know, I've thought about this before, like deeply about like how, you know, how they call something a body of work or like a
Yeah.
like a body of something. I think about like how like in poems, it's a body of words, and how like the author, the writer, makes that body come to life with meaning. And so that's also interesting too, because if we think about the pools, maybe each stands as like a body part. And like,
Yeah.
you know, so
Yeah, depending on how you approach a collection of poetry as well. This isn't the case for every poet, but often you find a collection of poetry that has a overarching theme or a
Right.
through line of content. It's not, again, not the same for every poet, but I can't, since we're speaking about bodies, you know, my thesis is titled Our Inherited Bodies.
that's right.
Yeah, and so my work shows the through line or the connection of the grandmother, the mother, and the daughter, and how we relate to our bodies in different ways. And I think that when we're talking about poetry, it's, you can, like I said, a stanza can be a pool, but a single poem can also be a pool in a whole collection.
Yes. Wow, that's really amazing. That's awesome. So yeah, like definitely the pool idea, it's awesome to meditate on. And this is something I'm going to throw at Peter too, because we were getting coffee earlier, Chelsea and I, and she asked me, she was like, does every creative writer think this way? Or wait, what is this question? Like, who is this speaking of? And I said, I think it's maybe just me. I said, creative writers can tend to enjoy the literary analysis essays. And why do they like them so much? I think because like it's creative to close read a text and like analyze the symbolism of like that story's interpretation. Before I go to you, Chelsea, do you agree? Like, or what are your thoughts
About
on
just
that?
literary analysis
Yeah,
essays
like
in general?
like I think creative writers like I gravitate towards them.
I think a creative writer might enjoy that for the same reason a doctor might do an autopsy.
Okay.
Where it's, you're taking something apart and figuring out how it functions precisely.
I love that.
And that's valuable information to have, and it can inform your own writing, or it can just help you better understand something that is perhaps a complex piece of writing.
Yeah, it's like you're putting a magnifying glass over this text, whether it's a short story, a novel, or a poem, and you're like, okay, as the author of this essay, I get to interpret and argue how I understood this text. So, but yeah.
Yeah. It also shows just the amount of intentionality that often goes into really good literary works, where you can go, the work itself might be a page, but you could write a 10, 20, 30-page essay, right?
Yeah.
Just discussing the intricacies and nuances of it.
Yeah.
And all of that has to do with just the intentionality of all the component parts of it.
Yeah, literary analysis they're fun, especially when you put like a couple short stories together. Like I think I did like during undergrad, like a Hemingway story and a John Steinbeck story, but like overlap and see how those symbolism in each story. It's just, I'm just gonna say it's fun. But I want to know your thoughts on like literary analysis, creative writers, like, or even
So-
writers in general, like you said.
Yeah, something that came to mind, and now of course I lost my train of thought, but when I remember doing literary analysis in my early undergraduate degree and high school and being told that my interpretation was wrong. And I think that that is not a unique experience for many people. And I think there are people who don't like literary analysis because they aren't given the creative freedom to really explore what the author could have meant. Their instructor is looking for like, no, this is what the author actually meant. And I think this is common within poetry too, where you might read a poem and you might simply not get it. And something I really had to ask myself throughout grad school was, how much do I want to make my reader work for meaning? That being said, I enjoy literary analysis.
Yes.
And I think it circles back to my values in poetry. And intentional word choice is very important to me. Mm-hmm. And word choice is how fiction writers build their literary devices. Mm. So literary analysis allows us to see how else language can be used to communicate or provoke or inspire. And as a poet, I'm so familiar with this, but I think people who don't practice poetry might struggle more with literary analysis.
I'm really happy you mentioned that. Like, I don't want to throw it towards Peter too. Like, something just came to mind. Whoever's listening, like maybe writers that do struggle with this, I think that's a real thing. I also find it shocking when you said that, because this right or wrong, or this objective and subjective message. And so I think we can all agree that in writing, we can't mind read the author completely, but we can say, okay, there is an objective message here, but on the subjective layer, I think as a writer, we should have room to explore that. And so to your response in essays, I'm like, if we are arguing something that's maybe unconventional, because I recently did this with a short story, and the professor responded and said, some comments of like, okay, how does that make sense? But if we can argue it well, I think it's valid. Do you know what I mean? Like, I think that's the skill we have to have, like, back it up. What are you going to back it up with to say, like, why is that legit? But,
well, yeah. Well, it ties back to what we were talking about earlier about argumentative essays, right? Is like looking for meaning in any piece of work, you're forming an argument for why you think it's doing something and how it's doing it and what's good about that or what's maybe not great about that or whatever, right? Yeah. So I don't think you can really have a wrong necessarily interpretation of some literary work unless you're operating with extremely incorrect assumptions. Like if I'm reading James Joyce and I'm like, oh, they're in space in the year 2040. They're not in Ireland.
Yeah, right.
Like that's like, but no one's really going to be doing that unless, they didn't read it.
Yeah, there's like far-fetched ideas, but like if it's something that's like subliminal or like symbolic, it's like, go for it. Like there shouldn't be a wrong tight kind of like box, like it's so interesting.
I think it's a great thing too when readers see something in your work that maybe you didn't intend. And I can't help but think of, please don't judge me, Draco Malfoy and Harry Potter.
No judgment.
Okay, we're gonna take it there. Okay. So there is a huge fan base that loves Draco, and they want this redemption arc for him, and they think that he's actually a good guy, and I think we experience a lot of empathy for him in the final books and movies, because we see this other side of like this hurting child. But then J.K. Rowling herself has said, oh no, he's not supposed to be a good guy. But so many people interpret it differently. So what is canon? That
reminds me, like we're talking 696 seminar class right now about there's never just one story. Never. There's so many layers. Within one human life, there are so many like personal, intricate stories that are overlapping with each other.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And my brother was Harry Potter for Halloween this past season.
That's beautiful.
That's so cool. But yeah, I mean, like, well, maybe we can just dive into the next like layer of like the intersection between writing and teaching, because you have recently become a lecturer of composition here at our very own Cal State Long Beach, and I just want to say congratulations, because
Thank
that's
you.
huge.
Yes.
That's big. And so how has that experience of teaching college students been? And even if or if not influencing your writing, how do those two practices work in partnership? Or
Yeah, teaching hasn't influenced my writing just yet, although my background in creative writing has influenced my course content. There is value in reading short stories and poetry alongside these traditional academic essays. And again, it circles back to word choice and strengthening rhetoric. I'm teaching them, my students, to write within the assigned genre. So at the beginning of the semester, when we had our personal narratives, I assigned them a couple short stories by Sandra Cisneros. And the same thing with the argumentative essays. I tried to present them with material that mirrored the type of language they needed to be using. So again, it hasn't inspired my writing just yet, but
understandable.
Yeah.
It's so fascinating too. Because recently, like, I've talked to a few professors on campus, David Hernandez and Sarah Arroyo, and I've talked to them about like the relationship editing, writing, and then being a professor all have in relationship with one another. And I think they both echoed like, yes, you can be all three of those things, but your relationship to those are all different. And so it's like you're so fresh into lecturing too, and so I'm sure like it'll be awesome to see how it goes. Yeah.
I think also just to be able to teach something is to have an understanding of it.
Right.
That seems kind of obvious, but like what I mean is like if you're looking at a piece of writing or something and figuring out how to convey something about it to someone who maybe isn't familiar with it, that means you have to dig into it and understand a bit of the nuance of it and what is trying to be achieved by it. In the same way, again, talking like an argumentative essay, right? You're creating an argument for why this has meaning, and then you're translating that into something that is easily digestible. And I think that translating into something simpler or more easily understood is also a way to make your writing better. In that, like, I think some of the best poetry, for example, I think is very brief. Like brevity is the soul of wit, right? And that it's much more difficult to convey a complex idea briefly than it is to do it in a roundabout, convoluted way, right? And some of the best writers are very good at being simple, tactful, right, succinct.
Yeah,
with
brief
what they say.
yet deep.
Brief yet deep.
Yeah.
That's perhaps the most difficult thing to do in writing. And so when you're teaching, you're basically doing that kind of process where you abbreviate things yet maintain meaning. And I think in doing that, you're practicing the act of just condensing your own writing in a way. You know what I mean?
I know, yeah, it's really interesting. And I think, like, I've thought about it recently, like, going into, in the future, a professor role. And I think one thing, too, to add on to that is, like, when you have this passion of writing and writing can either be a solitary act because it's very personal, but also there's workshops and it can be collective. I think what switched for me is like when I started thinking about how writing is like you're sharing this craft, this art, and you're passing it down to people who also are like in this same like world as you. And like I think that's what really turned like me interested into poetry, because it's like you get to share it with the world, not just keep it like with yourself, which there's nothing wrong with either way. But I think holding professional and like inspiring discourse in a classroom about something you love, that sounds dreamlike, like being a poetry professor or something. But yeah.
And there's nothing that will make you a stronger writer. Well, I shouldn't say nothing, but you're experiencing this right now since you are in your first semester of grad school, and I just finished mine. And when you spend time with the same people, they get to know your style of writing and you get to know theirs. And so the feedback you receive becomes stronger because they know they're going to tailor their criticism to, okay, what is Alexis writing about?
Right.
And when they know your content, my point is that you will become a stronger writer that way.
Absolutely. Like when you get to hear other people and their criticism, I think we talked, or we're going to talk about a little bit about like the importance of criticism and feedback, because that's the way we grow as a writer. We can't just listen to our own critical voice and say, okay, this is good. We need to send it out into the world. And so
not only receiving critical feedback, but also giving critical feedback for writing that isn't your own. Also, in
so
my
important.
experience, has helped me with my own writing. Not that I'm like kicking down and then I feel better, but
but
like,
and there's certain phrases that you can use. Like, there's a good opportunity in this poem to sharpen this area instead of just saying, "I hate that piece." Like you don't do. There's certain vernacular.
You can also just say you hate the piece, though.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Actually, you can be honest. It's true.
But I mean, like in looking at someone else's work and seeing how they write, first of all, and then what is working and what isn't working and how things are functioning. It gives you an insight into how other people are constructing their work, but also it gives you those same tools to look at your own work maybe from a more objective stance.
Yeah, we need each other. It's so important. And so, I guess the second is like any advice to any writers, including myself and Peter, because I think we both are thinking about professorship maybe, who plan to be professors in the future.
Yeah, my advice because I actually had a student, one of my old poetry students, visit my office last week from when I taught poetry while I was in grad school, and she asked me the same question. Two things. It's the advice is very like what I wish I had known 4 years ago. So first, seek out teaching experience early, even if it's not the subject or age group you're comfortable with. There are other things to be learned about classroom management and how to establish authority while maintaining approachability. This is something I've struggled with in previous jobs. Alexis and I have both worked at Target.
Yes,
so
Target.
We've talked about our experiences there.
Yes.
And were you a manager like I was?
I was a manager.
We were
front lanes,
both. Yes,
cashiers.
we were both service and engagement managers or team leads. And there I learned a lot about how to communicate.
Absolutely. People skills.
Yes. And
dealing,
so
de-stressing situations that are, angry guests.
I feel like any job where you have to work with the public.
Yeah. It helps.
Especially when in retail.
Yeah. Yeah. You build a muscle of patience for sure.
Yeah. So but that it transfers over into the classroom about maintaining that balance of authority, approachability, kindness. I think I'm a much nicer teacher than I was manager, but that might just be me learning. Yeah. But the second thing, so get that teaching experience.
That's good to know. And then, would you say like even tutoring helps?
Yes. Okay. Working at the University Writing Center, hi Tina, was one of the best things I could have done, because after a while you memorize or writing essays becomes muscle memory, and it's writing an essay versus explaining or teaching someone how to do it are two very different things. There are basic things you forget because they become so natural. So working in the tutoring center, the writing center, it re-taught me those little things that beginning writers need to know. So
that's amazing.
I don't think I would be as successful a composition teacher if I had not tutored first. So tutoring, getting substitute jobs perhaps, or there's a lot of programs out there that you can get teaching experience through, but I was unfamiliar with all of those. I got my teaching experience very late, but I've been lucky in how I've navigated work, I guess. But the second piece of advice is establish professional relationships from multiple sources. Do not underestimate the value of networking, because you will need letters of recommendation. And in my experience, you typically, so when I applied for my position here at Cal State Long Beach, I needed a letter of recommendation outside of Cal State Long Beach.
Wow. Yeah.
So I had established that, but I also know people who didn't have that available, or maybe they didn't have strong references outside of Cal State Long Beach. So establishing, just networking and getting those relationships, those two pieces of advice.
That's interesting. So you I hear you encouraging this. I think it's easy for us to stay for instance, liberal arts majors, we're in this, we're in this hall, we're going down and we're in that world. But to expand and to branch out, to have more vast options of connections. I think that's so important.
No one succeeds on their own.
Really. Yeah.
Yeah. So you have to, just like how you have to workshop with other people and you have to look at their work and they have to look at yours. You have to, I don't know.
You're right.
It seems kind of obvious, but you just have to talk to people.
You do.
And talk about things you're passionate about and seek out opportunities.
Yeah. And it can be uncomfortable. I think one thing in grad school I've found out is that, but there's been more opportunities, and it's been so easy to just let me meet in the office hours of a professor and just begin this networking. And it's one of the best things ever, because you're building relationship and rapport with people who really want to support you.
Yeah.
So it's really great.
And it doesn't hurt to bring them donuts or cookies.
It never does. Yep. And then you'll walk in sometimes and you'll get a free literary journal that they'll hand to you.
Reciprocity.
Thanks, David.
I was going to say that was David.
David. Yeah, so kind.
Shout out. Yeah.
But well, let's just go into the literacy aspect and the reading, because I know you also have worked for the Institute of Reading Development, and over summer we had a conversation and I really saw your heart for literacy and seeing the value in its accessibility for all students. Why do you think preserving literacy is so important, and what have you learned in being a voice for it?
I have had this conversation so many times in the best way.
Yeah.
So first of all, working for the Institute of Reading Development, I got a lot of teaching experience through that program. That's one of the programs I worked for. But working for them opened my eyes to the literacy crisis that we are facing. There is a real crisis. I taught classes in both California and Florida last summer. That was a super fun opportunity.
I know. I remember when you went over there.
I know. They were like, hey, can you teach in Florida? Great, you leave in 24 hours. And
your natural hair is curly, right? And then I know there was a picture and it was nice and curly.
Yes.
The humidity, guys.
I have, the wavy curly hair, and I got to Florida, and you know what? It was frizz, but it was also just suddenly my products were melting.
I know. I've been to Florida once, and it's humid out there.
Yeah, but I loved it, though.
Yeah.
Iguanas everywhere. They have iguanas out there like we have ducks.
When it gets too cold, they all fall out of the trees.
Okay.
You know that?
I found out.
Yeah.
I sure found out. I went for a walk, and suddenly something that's 15 pounds falls out of the tree next to me.
Okay, I wouldn't want to be under that and get hit on the head.
No, probably not.
I derailed us. I'm sorry. Go
There
ahead.
are worse reptiles in Florida.
Okay.
Yeah, iguanas are not the problem. But,
Gators.
Right, but literacy. So teaching these classes, the experience really inspired me to move towards these students that you suspect need help. Don't wait for them to ask you. When students reach a certain age, it's often assumed that they can read. And as educators, we have to stop assuming literacy. What I learned is that, where to even begin?
No.
It's the amount of students that were struggling to read in ages 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, these ages where you assume they can mostly read already. Mm-hmm. It's not always the case, and I think this transition that we had 4 years ago with COVID and a lot of these students moving on to Zoom, students who were in 8th grade maybe struggling to read didn't have access to that direct help anymore moving to Zoom, so it's possible it got ignored. And so working for this program and then moving into teaching these 18-year-olds who, I don't want to call them pandemic babies, that's something else, but they experience the core of their high school via Zoom.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'm approaching it, I have a whole new mindset, hey, I don't want to make assumptions about where they are academically. So my pedagogy has always been to meet my students where they're at, but now I'm still doing that, but I'm meeting them without these preconceived notions about where they're supposed to be. So if someone along the line has failed them, and I'm not saying that it's a parent or a teacher, someone is to blame, that's not it. It can be, unfortunately, the world that we live in with COVID, and that did them a disservice in their academic journey. It's my job now to provide them with support and resources so that they still have the same opportunities.
Opportunities. That's a great word, because I was just, as you were speaking, I was thinking about in all of history, if you think about these gifts of reading and writing, the freedom it opens up, the agency it opens up, the opportunities that it opens up to communicate with others and expand in life. Like when I think about those that weren't taught to read or write, that's heart-shattering to me, because those are so, everybody deserves to learn those two gifts.
Yes, I think I love the word gift. I use that word a lot in my poetry, actually. And working with these kids, I could tell, and you probably hear this from a lot of teachers, but you can tell, like, okay, so these students are being read to. These students are not being read to. You can tell the difference in how they're progressing. And I think that it's not every child has the same opportunity, because if mom and dad work 2 jobs and they're not home in the evening to read, but then the other family, they are home in the evening, they do have the opportunity to read. It's all about those opportunities. So like, where can I, as an educator, fill in those gaps?
That's so important.
Yeah. It's also important to have like resources available, because a lot of people, I don't know, like my cousin, he has dyslexia. I'm sure lots of people do. One of my stepbrothers had a pretty severe learning disability growing up, so he had difficulty learning, just reading, writing, math, etc. Right? He had like dysgraphia, which is like I have another friend who has that, where it's like dyslexia except for writing. So it's just a more difficult time writing. But I don't know. There exist all these things that make it more difficult for certain individuals. And if you compound that on top of existing disparities, right, where maybe parents don't have time to read, the kids are in a single parent household or whatever, what have you, extenuating circumstances, or honestly, you know, this varies a lot from state to state. Like in Florida, it's a lot worse than here in California. There's some places where it's better than California or whatever. But I don't know. There should be opportunities available, because honestly, through education is the way which people can move up or just experience life, you know? And, you know, not everything requires you to have a deep understanding of literature, but, you know, just that critical understanding of reading. First of all, it's built upon being able to read. And then being able to have critical thought helps you in many aspects of life, and it also helps people to be just good members of society, right?
Absolutely.
If you're, you know, I don't know. So
Fixed it for the sake of communication, too.
And it's frustrating that there aren't, I don't know, I feel like many people often have a perception that we live in like a meritocracy where there is a true equality of opportunity, and that just isn't true, just because of things like this, where people don't have the same access to just things as basic as being able to read.
I can't speak on this too deeply, because I've only heard it, but like even just like in elementary schools, I heard that creative writing was sort of paused on being taught, and you know, maybe it's back, but when I heard that, I was like shocked. I'm like, wow, like even just practicing penmanship and all these gifts.
I can't even read cursive.
I think my writing is like a mix of print and cursive. Shout out to all the people that do that. But like, it's just, it's so interesting. And I also have a heart for literacy. So thank you for what you did during that reading development. Even, I know we talked about youth, because like, yes, we need to continue to raise up like the next generation. And I'm instantly like reminded of like open mics, and also as college students, like we need those spaces to get out there and listen to others read their work. And shout out, which we can mention at the end too, but December 5th, we are having the first on-campus RipRap open mic, and I hope everyone who's listening can come in the Beach Auditorium. So that's going to be from 7 to 9 on December 5th. But anyways, just wanted to shout that out, because I think it's no matter what age. Like even elderly people, you know, they love to be read to too. And like even hear themselves read. It's amazing. We need that.
Yeah, and a lot of, you know, as you get older, your eyesight begins to go.
Yeah.
And I think that, I'm just thinking about that, the group of people who, you know, might not be able to physically read anymore simply because of their eyes, and they should still be able to get to enjoy that.
Yeah.
So there was something else that was said that I wanted to comment on. I don't remember what it was.
You're good. Was it on the topic of literacy? Or
Yes.
like reading? To clarify, literacy under the blanket involves both reading and writing, right? I know we've been sort of emphasizing reading, but writing as well.
And I remember my idea now. Or not my idea, but
Here
my
we
thing that I
go.
was going to share. So it's when we were talking about literacy, and it's not necessarily having to understand these deep, intense literary novels, but even something as simple as journaling.
Yes.
Being able to express ourselves.
Every
Literacy helps with that. For those of us who may not be able to verbally express our feelings, writing them down can help us process our emotions, and we become more well-rounded people because of that.
Just on a side tangent, like this just reminds me of Jacques Lacan, which is he's a French psychoanalyst from way back then, but we just studied him in 696, and he talked about speech therapy. But my thesis and argument was saying when we can't use speech, when people are at a loss of words, how can they use creative arts like writing or painting to communicate their feelings? I think that sort of touches base on what you're saying. It's so powerful, you know? Yeah. We need it.
We need it.
Yeah. Well, okay, this is awesome. Like, I'm really enjoying this conversation with you, Chelsea and Peter. This is amazing. Inspiration, I guess we'll just go into like the little fun questions now. Inspiration as of late. So who are you reading right now?
So I've been rereading the post-election. I've been rereading American Sonnets for My Past and Future Assassin by Terrence Hayes. I'm visiting my dad next week in Montana, and I sent some pictures of some of the poems to our family group chat. And my stepsister, she says, please bring the book. So
awesome.
I'll be bringing that with me. And then I also recently read Running by Gil Scott-Heron to my students at Santa Monica College.
Yes, because you also work there.
Yes, I also work there. And Running, so this is a poem so my sister's a dancer. This is the second time I'm talking about my sister today on this podcast.
Sisters, we love sisters.
Love sisters. She's a dancer, and Running by Gil Scott-Heron, it has this beat to it, this background music when you pull it up on YouTube. It's beautiful.
That's cool.
And she was in a piece where she danced to this poem, and she's also used the same piece to choreograph for her own students because she's a teacher. She teaches dance. And we were looking through different spoken word poetry the other day that she might use for potential choreography. She likes choreographing to poems with sound or spoken word. Yeah. So we're trying to kind of build her this arsenal of content to use. And I was reminded of Running, and I shared it with my students at SMC the other day. So that's what I'm reading right now.
That's amazing. Oh my gosh. And it was this past spring. That was the first time I ever witnessed this, but a ballerina she's my friend as well, from Florida. We're talking about Florida.
What is happening?
I don't know what's happening.
Florida and sisters and friends.
Yeah, she lives in Florida, but she's a professional ballerina, and I had posted a poem called Spring is for Second Chances, and she had read it, and it was much like a resurrection from a dark place poem, and she said, I'd love to dance to this. So we have that, and she put that out there, and she did a whole ballerina choreograph at Walt Disney World's resort because she lives close to Walt Disney World. Really cool, but I can't and I can encourage that enough. Pairing multimedia, with audio of poetry, and then there's a dancer. So cool. Shout out to your sister. Yeah.
Also, poetry's not that much different from song, right?
You know,
if you think about it, honestly, there was a time in history.
Depends who you ask.
Yeah, it depends on who.
Depends who you ask.
And on the poem and on the song, but there was a time, I guess, where I don't know. I'm thinking thousands of years ago, where poems and songs were more or less.
They were more
thing.
married.
Yeah, more. I don't know. I I like doing that, though, writing poems with rhythmic qualities in them that are
it.
heavily focused on rhyme, not so much on meaning, just
Is
on
that
the way words sound.
when it becomes spoken word? You know, like I always try to understand what is spoken word. I think it's when it's the emphasis of speaking it, but with like this like theatrical element, right? Or what?
I don't know. Genre is a weird thing, right? Because it's like, what is spoken word poem and what is like a song? Like is Walk on the Wild Side by Lou Reed, is that spoken word because he just kind of talks the lyrics instead of sings them, right? I don't know if you've heard that before.
I haven't, but I'm just thinking like it's a whole world of spoken word artists out there. Yeah.
I think it's more like which idea comes first. Like, is this poetry followed by sound, or is this sound accompanied by words, you know?
Interesting.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Maybe that's a bit esoteric.
Yeah, no, it's really interesting. Awesome. And so, like, the next question is just, what writing are you working on right now? I know you are so busy working at 2 colleges, and so has there been anything, like, that's been sparking your interest? I know you just recently finished your thesis, My Inherited Body, or
Our Inherited Bodies.
Our Inherited Bodies. Thank you.
Yeah.
But how's that been going? Your writing journey?
Oh, it's been tough because I graduated and then I said I dove right into my job with the Institute of Reading Development. So I was teaching full time, and I said I deserve a break. It's okay that I'm not writing right now. I just graduated. Just making these excuses. And then I finally had a week of rest. And then Dr. Klink calls me and she's, hey, can you teach comp? And I said, yes, ma'am. I sure can. And so I dove right into that. And then I started at Santa Monica and I'm teaching these classes. And
You're busy.
I'm busy.
Yep.
Yeah, and it's hard. And I think I've been really hard on myself because when I've had these pockets of time, I'm not using them for writing. I'm using them to, I need to do the dishes. I need to relax. I need...
all important things.
Yeah, all important things. And I think I want to be better about it. And I did set a timer for 45 minutes, like 3 months ago, to where I said, okay, I'm going to write for these 45 minutes. And it was okay, like what I came up with, it felt good to be practicing that. Yeah. That being said, I am not currently writing anything, but I did recently go back and revise a couple of fruit poems that I have. Ooh. Yes, one of them is called Red Fruit and the other is Violet Fruit.
Ooh.
Yes, and they are meant to... They accompany another poem that I have about the loss of my bearded dragon when I had to euthanize him last year, and it was a horrible experience. However, I have a poem about that, and I'm trying to figure out where I want to place these fruit poems because they have to do with I don't want to say life and death. That's a little too on the nose. It's more so decay and thriving.
I love that juxtaposition.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
So I'm trying to figure out where I want to put those in my larger collection. So I do have the poetry portion of my thesis, this manuscript that I want to build. That's on the way. I have my theme for it. I'm going to continue this theme of bodies. And for a graduation present, my mother gave me pieces. I got family heirlooms, essentially, beautiful. Since so much of my thesis is about family. I inherited watches. So my mother's first watch, my grandmother's first watch, and my great-grandmother's first watch from 1924.
My goodness.
Back when people still wore watches.
Right, and her wrists were so tiny, these tiny little wrists. And so these watches, and I was given a jar of dirt from the family farm in Indiana, and I was given a picture of my great-great-grandfather, who also kept journals, I learned. Wow. So all these little pieces, these were treasures. Yes, they were gifted to me. There's more, but I won't list every single one that were gifted to me for my graduation. And the point of this gift was to inspire me further to keep writing poetry. And so I want to write about these things, about the watches and the dirt. And I have a poem about sand. I didn't mention the sand, but I have inspiration and I have these ideas, but I just haven't had the chance to sit down and
You know what?
do it.
I'm so happy you mentioned all of that. Thank you.
Yeah.
Chelsea, because
Yeah.
a couple of things just came to mind that I think like the listeners, I hope this encourages anybody that's listening. It's encouraging me as a writer myself. Like you're talking about this season of life where things are, you hit the ground running after graduation
Yeah.
and you are very much a writer. And the phrase that I've heard before and I've also struggled with, like, imposter syndrome, for instance. So let's say we hit a dry patch or we hit a season where we're just not writing. That does not mean by any means you're any less of a writer. It's in you, and that's a gift that you have. I think like I commend you for setting like timers, because it's good. Even if you say it's not that good of material, you still sat down and exercised and like that writing gift. And like I think doing that consistently, like whether it's just scribbling on your Apple Notes real quick, like an idea, or in that. So there's that. Like I think that, and then the last thing I wanted to mention is just time. You said like there's things that you see, you foresee yourself like putting together, but also it's time. Like I don't have time because I'm busy, but time, I need to give it time to soak in. Like I need to allow this piece to evolve and become what it's going to become in its own time. I found that in my own poetry. I'm like, I can't rush this piece. I can't force it. Thoughts, anybody? That's just,
I think that's, I don't know. In my experience, I find being able to write being a pretty fickle thing where, especially, honestly, if I'm going into it with like a specific thing I want to write about or a specific piece of inspiration maybe, or so I think, I find it a lot harder because I'm trying to summarize some entire idea that I have in my brain into so few lines to start out with. I'm like, that's not right, that's not right, that's not right. And I find, I still can't force myself to do this on a whim, but I find that if I just start writing basically slop, whatever, it doesn't matter what it is, just sounds, that part of an idea will begin to emerge. And once it's already on the page and I have that next to maybe another idea, then I can see what those two things mean to each other. And then from that, I can start writing something. It's not something I planned to write, but it is something that is nevertheless still like, true to me.
Yeah.
And
you can recycle certain things. You can, let's say, like you said, slop. Like you can write something and you can pluck out little gems that maybe just like emerged from that writing time.
It's like reading tea leaves or throwing spaghetti on the wall and seeing what shapes it's made.
It's
a little bit of chaos at first.
The best work isn't forced, I don't think. I think it's organically, it comes to be, and you can have grace with it and you can see how it takes shape, and it's really beautiful.
That being said, discipline is important.
Right. Also, I know, let's not be all like hippie, like, like have fun with your writing, but also,
get it done.
Discipline, yes. But like, you know what? Honestly, this has been such a great conversation. I'm wondering, Chelsea, because you did bring a book of poetry, if you'd be able to read this last piece, piece that you brought. If you could name the book collection and then read this piece for us. Yeah.
Yes. So this is a collection titled Not for Luck by Derek Sheffield. I originally read this poem in, I don't remember what the journal was, but it was published in a journal, and I fell in love with it, and David Hernandez helped me track down the actual collection. So
amazing.
This is titled, It Wasn't the Laundry. The father could not have known the woman he'd hired to be with his children while he followed his work to far cities would bring such pain. It wasn't the laundry, floors, or sack lunches, not the dropping off or picking up that did it. It came after dinner when she called them to a game and kept calling until even the boy closed the latest in a series of books where he'd been since his mother had left, and unlocked his door and walked downstairs to get it over with. With that woman and his two sisters, he sat around the little-used dining room table to connect 4 colored discs or link cool tiles with clicks across the polished wood or lay down a card. Uno. The pain they learned began in queries about their day and help with fractions and how to stitch a rip and fry potatoes. It grew in flowers from her garden. The blue wheels of bachelor's buttons and purple-hearted sweet William. Do we live in your days, mother? Where this time, father? their faces, over years around that table, starting to smile, to fly into laughter. Now that woman, neither mother nor father, lies in a distant bed. Different people on different shifts lift spoons to her mouth, change her sheets. There is no more calling or hearing, and no games but the one in her eyes turned toward a window, where twice a day twilight touches her face, being neither day nor night, but a little of both. And both end and beginning. Here is the hurt. Their father did not know he was buying in every check he left on the kitchen counter.
That was nice.
That was very profound. Chills.
Yeah.
Deep family poem in a lot of ways.
Yes, yeah.
Oh my gosh. I wish we had more time, Chelsea. I just
Yeah.
want to thank you so much for just taking the time to speak with us. You had so much great insight. And so
Thank you for having me.
Yes,
Of course.
yes. We can carry the conversation as we go. And reminder, guys, December 5th is our open mic for Rip Rap. Come on campus for the Beach Auditorium. Thank you, guys.
And there will also be an off-campus open mic in addition, I believe, on November.
That's tentative. I think
Is it
we're
tentative?
Yep.
Never mind.
We'll pause on that one, but for
December
sure,
5th.
December 5th, 7 to 9, Beach Auditorium.
Be there or be square.
Yeah.
All right. This has been Rip Rap Yap. Thanks for joining us, and tune in next time. Goodbye.